So do I use the intensity for load selection or do I go by feel? So the thing about the intensity, so if you look at the 1RM continuum, there's an intensity that's associated to each repetition. And I use these intensities mostly as a guide to build my 12-week macro cycle and a guide to see which reps I'm going to use for each mesocycle within the macro cycle. Because if you only look at the rep and you don't think about the intensity associated to it, sometimes it can be a little bit misleading because you don't have a clear picture of by how much you're pushing the intensities. Are the gaps too big? Are the gaps too small? So by prescribing the intensities first, you have a clearer picture of your dispatch of reps through the macro cycle. So that's the main reason I do that. Now, when it comes to load selection, now you have the program. You go in the weight room, you start training your client. So you can use the intensity as a guide. Okay, so for example, let's say that you choose 80%, which is 7 reps, and your phase, you had planned to do 5 sets of 7. So now if you know the 1RM or the estimated 1RM, now you can use that 80% as a guide to how much weight you should be using for that workout. But at the end of the day, rep is king. You always want to make sure that you hit the rep target that you prescribe. So some people at a certain percentage, although the 1RM continuum is fairly accurate for your multi-joint compound movement, sometimes some people for 80% they might only be able to do 6 reps, and other people they might be able to do 8 reps or 9 reps maybe. Okay, so there's a little bit of variability between people. So you start the session with 80 in mind, 80% in mind. So let's say you had 100 kilos, so you know that your target for your 5 sets of 7 will be 80 kilos. But you have to start a little bit lighter, a little bit more conservative, so you can do step loading from set to set, and then the way you look at the way the athletes react, and then you make adjustments in load. So if you figure out on set number 3 that your progression to reach 80 is a little too harsh, then you can relax the progression, and maybe that at the end he's going to finish at 77.5 kilo instead of 80. But that's okay. And the opposite is true. If you realize it's too easy, then you can bump up the progression a little bit more, because what you're looking for, the real goal, whenever you're using step loading with standard sets, you prescribe 5 sets of 7. So the goal is that last set, that 5th set, you do 7 reps, and that 7th rep is a true 7 RM, meaning that you did 7, but you could not have done 8. If you do that, you know you've nailed the load. And I don't care at this point if you hit 80 kilos, or if you're at 78 kilos, or if you're at 82 kilos. At the end of the day, rep is king, and the rep dictates the load. The intensity associated to it is a guide, but you need to adjust. So you do step loading, adjust throughout to make sure that that last set you reach failure. Because if you stick to the load exactly, and then your client, for reason XYZ, cannot do 7 reps with that load, well then what happens is your volume prescription gets short. So we have to understand that intensity and volume are 2 important components of the training process. So if you prescribe 5x7, which is 35 reps of rep volume, but you stick to the percentage and somehow that client can only do, let's say, 5 reps at that percentage, well then it's 5 sets of 5, which is 25 reps instead of 35 reps. So now you're way short of your volume target. So this becomes counterproductive. Okay, so again, at the end of the day, the percentages of the 1RM continuum, they're there to help you guide the programming, guide the weight selection, but in the end, you need to adjust so that the rep becomes king. The rep dictates everything. Can I explain structural balance? So structural balance, this is a concept that I learned from Charles Poliquin in the late 90s. And what it means basically is that in order to perform optimally and in order to reduce the incidence of injuries, the body should be, the strength of the muscles within your body should be balanced between one another. So, you don't want the upper back to be significantly weaker than the chest, for example, and stuff like that. So what you do is you use strength ratios, and there are certain classification or ranges with certain lifts that you should hit in order to be assumed structurally balanced, so that you don't have discrepancies of strength between muscles. So for example, the mother lift for upper body is bench press. So they use the bench press as the guide to all other upper body lift. So if your bench press is 100 kilos, so that's your 1 RM, then you take the other lift, so let's say the incline press or the dip, and then whatever your estimated 1 RM score is on the incline press and the dip, you compare it to your bench press. And then you look, am I in the zone that I need to be, or am I way outside of the zone? So, for example, the dip should be 117% of your bench press. So if your dip for some reason is 82% of your bench press, then you know that you have a significant strength discrepancy in your dip compared to your bench press. So now you know that you can focus on improving, you can do like a block to improve your dip so that you narrow the gap between your dip and your bench so you become more structurally balanced. So this is structural balance in terms of the big lifts, but then there are also ratios with more assistance and remedial work. So for example, you have to look at the shoulder girdle. So how strong are your rotator cuffs? Are your rotator cuff muscles too weak compared to your bench press? So if your rotator cuffs are too weak, then you know that you need to focus on increasing the strength of your rotator cuff, because now if they're too weak, they're not strong enough to balance out the strength expression of the big prime movers of your pressing movement, which can lead to long-term injuries and even lead to a lack of performance, because the external rotators could send an inhibitory signal that prevents you to progress in terms of strength, because there's too much strain being promoted on the shoulder joint with this spore of strength of the rotator cuff. So it's really just a training phase where the focus is on balancing muscle groups and or lifts in order to get the proper ratios of strength between all that musculature to peak performance and avoid injury. So this is typically the kind of phase that you would do either starting with a new client or in the early phase of the general preparation phase with your athletic population. So with beginner clients, do I start them with 2 times a week training sessions? No. To me, the 2 times a week, I will only do this if somebody can only afford to just do 2 times a week. If their schedule is too busy and they can just do 2 times, we'll do 2 times. But even with beginners, my goal is always to have them in the weight room 4 times a week. Even more so with beginners, because the beginner needs to learn. They need to get better at doing the lifts. And on top of it, the beginner is not strong. So the dip in the recovery curve from a training session from a beginner is not as big as the dip on a recovery curve from a guy who squats 600 pounds. So because of that, the actual frequency at which the beginner can train and effectively recover from is much higher. So if you take that into account, plus the fact that they need to learn movements, to me, if I could get them in the gym 4 times a week, you're just going to speed up the process way more. For example, the problem with 2 times a week, and especially if you decide to do 2 different workouts, so maybe on one session you have a split squat and the other session you don't. Now you have the beginner who has poor intra and intermuscular coordination. You do that split squat on Monday, but then you're not touching that lift again until the next Monday. That's 7 days without stimulating that client to do a split squat. So the learning curve is really, really, really low. So that's why, to me, 2 times a week is really just a function of lack of time. It's not really a question of being a beginner, advanced, or intermediate. Okay, so for the most part, 4 times a week, no matter what, is usually my target. What's a good phase to prescribe following a phase where we did eccentric training during the preseason? So this question is a little bit unclear because I don't know if the person asking the question, I'm not sure what they mean by preseason. Because technically speaking, preseason is what we called in sports periodization the pre-competitive phase. So this is the phase usually when the athlete is at training camp. So it's the phase right before the start of the season. So in reality, the pre-season phase or the pre-competitive phase, you should never do any eccentric method at that point. It would be very counterproductive because one, eccentric training, the time that it takes once you finish an eccentric phase to reap the benefit of that training phase takes anywhere from 6 to about 8 weeks. Plus the strain that it gives you training the eccentric methods really, because it creates so much trauma that it disrupts your ability to exert speed and power. So if you're in the pre-competitive phase, where in reality at that point in time, it's all about rate of force development, it's all about improving speed strength components to really get ready for the season in terms of velocities, you cannot afford to do an eccentric method. Now, if the person meant the off season, and now, let's assume that off season was what he meant, then in the specific preparation phase, for example, let's say that you were to do in the early SPP phase, eccentric based mesocycle, then you have to make sure that the phase after, the focus is on speed strength. So depending on the weakness of the athlete, the focus could be on explosive strength methods, or it could be on reactive strength methods. But what you want to do as soon as you do an eccentric phase is get to some speed strength action to kind of reteach the central nervous system to be fast again. Because those slow eccentric contractions, as great as they are slow contractions. But as an athlete, as soon as you get closer to the season, you need to really teach the brain to be fast again. So that's why I like to combine speed strength methods in the following phases after an eccentric phase.